there anything you want to talk to me about?
Well, yeah, but I don't think it's for the air.
Like what?
It's happening again.
The itching?
Whoa, I knew you were going to go there. No,
Really?
It's not. It's
You did?
Yeah, I knew you were going to think that because what else would it be?
Well,
what else would it be?
Literally, it could be
My
anything.
penis itches again?
Your what?
No, don't try to trick me. I hate when people
What
do
did
this.
you just say?
My penis itches again, but I did it in an upspeak to denote a question. My penis itches again.
That's not at all where I was
What did you think itched? What did you think itched?
Your scalp.
Oh, my scalp itched. Yeah, right, my scalp itched. Yeah, right, my scalp. Ladies and gentlemen, we are Gas Meat Light. Thy name is Liz.
No way. You are the master, very clearly, by what was just demonstrated here.
What was just demonstrated here? I haven't started speaking yet.
Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. Come in. Jeffrey Epstein.
It's crazy how much better men are at gaslighting than women.
Okay, first of all, I'm looking up gaslight on Google right now and it's saying no results because it's not a word. It seems to have just been something completely invented by you. But then again, aren't we all just inventions in your mind? That's the thing. If you're going to gaslight someone, you got to
In a way, we all are inventions in each other's mind.
That's true. Sometimes I think that the entire universe is virtual reality. And then sometimes the simulation breaks, right? For instance, I was watching TV the other day, shirtless, and there's a bunch of the Republican guys up there talking, like a debate sort of thing.
Wait, were you watching the debate or just
I don't know.
TV?
They were talking against each other. There was a versus.
I love that you act like you have no idea what's going on at any point when a TV screen is on.
I was watching a versus.
You were just sitting watching TV.
It was a verbal combat between many people who were Republicans.
Okay.
And in the middle of this, what do I see? Literally Vivek from the video game Morrowind. And I'm just like, all right, okay, maybe turn it back on and, turn it off and turn it back on again. This simulation is glitching. And, I write to his campaign. I donate. I volunteer. And I try to get closer to him to be like, you should go back in the computer from 15 years ago. And I finally get up to the guy. Massive dude, by the way. 5'9", 5'8", fucking towering over me. And I look up at him, and
But his hair is like 4 inches of that.
Okay, you're literally thinking of just a different Indian guy. You're thinking of
he's
a
got
non...
crazy hair too. I'm not thinking
He
of
does?
that guy. I'm not thinking of the McKinsey guy. I'm thinking of the guy who's running for president,
Yes,
allegedly.
Vivek, he has big hair. He did a pickleball video the other day.
His forehead too is quite large.
He looks stretched. You know what I'm saying? Not to body shame.
Yeah, Stretch Armstrong.
Stretch
style.
Armstrong. Yeah, it's
yeah.
like it's like when you
A little
manipulate
whoop.
a photo in Canva.
Yeah.
And so I go up to him and I look straight up into his nostrils and I say, "What's up, dude? Are you real?" And he calls the police and
A cool thing to ask people is, "Are you real?"
just because that lady on the airplane did it, which
Yeah.
I'm sick of that. That was to me the lady on the airplane. Not to talk about the online too much. The lady on the airplane.
Well, it did happen like 3 months ago.
To me, that's the redhead countryman.
What do you
That's
mean?
all the same of a thing to me.
The lady?
The lady on the airplane, you're not real, you're not real.
Oh yeah, she's just the redhead country. I understand where you're going
That's
with this.
all the same to me. Not my, get it out of here.
Yeah,
not my business.
She is a, what were those boys? The
Island Boys.
No, but that's another one.
Okay.
The what were the little Trump boys? What were their name? What was the school they were with?
Boys? Are you talking his sons?
No.
Barron? Covington? They're Covington. They're Covington to you.
They're Covington teens.
Entrance. Yeah, they're Covington to me. They're
Yes.
like, they're just.
It's giving Covington.
Because my thing is like, maybe she's not real. Like maybe none of these are real, and it's just like it's a bad hallucination. It's like they're shadow people.
Right. The
Made
shadow
flesh.
people come out when just the world becomes the TV.
I told you about my idea. I know we have a serious interview, but did I tell you about my idea?
We also haven't said hello to anyone, and I'm not going to.
I'm not going to either. They can get it when they get it. Did I ever tell you about my idea for a movie that I came up with in rehab?
I don't know. Hit me.
But to add about 20 more minutes in this episode. So, okay. You know how there's all these stoner comedies, right? Seth Rogen.
Like the ones from like 5 years, 6 years,
What's it
7 years
called?
ago?
Washed. I'm gonna call it Smoked Out. What's called? It's the movie where he's like him and Pineapple Express. Not
the stoner
completely
name you were
different.
thinking of.
Pineapple Express. Why do I want to call it Smoked Up or Smoked Out? Half Baked.
But that's like early.
Half Baked is, but of the genre of the stoner comedy, right? Because weed used to be the #1 drug in America.
It's not.
It probably is, but
No.
you know what's kind of rising?
SSRIs.
No, but there are a lot. Let me tell you, there's a lot of comedies out there that I would characterize as SSRI comedies. Methamphetamine. There's not been a lot of meth comedies. So my idea is there's a guy.
That's so fucked up.
It starts in the future. It starts in the future. I've done meth frequently. So this is from not anymore.
Yeah,
but-
yeah. Here
So
we go.
we have a guy in the future, right?
As a meth user.
And he's a meth head. And meth is still the same. They aced that formula. They didn't have to invent new ones. He's fucking tweaking. His old lady, she's addicted to cyberfentanyl. And so she's all like,
What's cyberfentanyl?
it's like a fentanyl, but you get it in like a chit and you insert it into a thing in your neck.
Okay.
But it works essentially the same. And so he's like, he's always ready. He's wordy. He's horny. And he realizes, now that I'm thinking of this is probably not the right episode to tell this story on. I'm just telling the story a different episode.
Wait, you can't do that.
This is like a serious subject matter, and I feel like that this would. I'll tell the story next episode. My name is Brace.
Wait, what?
It would be just too much. It would take up too much time. I'm Brace. It involves a leprechaun and a lot of time traveling stuff.
But now you got me.
I know I got you, but I also hopefully got the audience, which wasn't why I did that.
I'm Liz.
but-
We're joined by producer Young Chomsky. This is TrueAnon. Hello.
Hello.
Here's my thing, though. I do think the idea of like a meth comedy is
Yes.
very funny.
It's really good.
Not as something you want to watch, but like the idea of it as a thing is very funny.
I came up with it in rehab.
Yeah.
Because I had nothing to do but sit and
It's
think.
fucked. The meth. Yeah. I wonder who could do that. Who could pull that off?
Oh, I'm sure I could find the skinniest motherfucker in
No,
Midtown.
but I feel like it takes a certain, a clown of a high aptitude
who's-
clown
what's
to
his
pull
name?
off
What's his-
a meth,
What's his name? The fucking Corey Feldman?
No, dude. Oh
You
my
don't think
God.
Feldman can do it?
What? No, that's just sad.
I
and
have access
true.
to Feldman.
No, you need a good. No, I'm talking about like a good comedy actor. Who can get the audience on his side? Like the thing about stoner comedies is you're like, okay, these guys are kind of like lovable, like
losers.
yeah.
Yeah.
Meth, look, that's an uphill battle to
It's an
sell.
uphill battle. Yeah, it's an uphill battle.
And the last sort of meth, let's say dark comedy was like what, Breaking Bad?
No, well, yeah, I never saw it, but
And so you know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
you sort of that went like too far. But so you need a kind of how do you make meth lovable?
I'll be honest with you. I have about a 15-minute explanation of how I
But
can.
we're gonna do it next episode.
It involves. I got to tell you, it involves a leprechaun. It is a central character in this.
but a real leprechaun or like someone who think but is
That's
this
part of the. It's a psychological.
have you
funny,
seen
comedy movie?
what's the one with Anna Faris? It's not
I don't
meth,
even
it's a
know
stoner
who the fuck
comedy,
that is.
obviously.
I don't know who that is.
Stop. What's the Smiley Face? Have you seen that?
No.
What?
Anya de Armas? Anya Faris? Smiley
Neither
Face?
of you have seen Smiley
Never
Face?
heard of that. I don't know who the actress or
Oh my
the
god,
movie
are
is.
you fucking kidding
See,
me?
this is a Smiley Face movie. Is it Smile, the scary movie about smiling that came out
No,
last year?
dude, this is a fucking classic. Go
Oh,
back to
John Krasinski? Speaking of the CIA,
No, go back to school.
I'm looking at it. Hi, how are you? Is what it says. And Anna Faris is hugging
Oh yeah.
it's a 2007 American-German stoner comedy.
Yeah, it's Gregoraki. It's a fucking classic. Go back to school, watch Smiley Face, and then get back to me.
Right
Hello,
or-
everyone.
Hello.
We have a hell of an episode
We
today.
have a really good episode.
Yeah.
Skip 45 minutes ahead after I finish telling this leprechaun story to hear it. No, just kidding. No, we have a episode. We're interviewing Orasami Burton about his work on, I guess.
Wait, real quick. Or Sami, if you're listening, which you probably are, maybe if you're that kind of person, which is also cool if you are.
I would be.
I'm so sorry for the intro to this.
Yeah, Liz was rude.
No, the
And
intro that we just did.
We didn't just do an intro. What are you talking about? We just started recording the
I hate you
episode.
so much. I hate you so much.
Sorry, I literally just walked in the door. Liz, it's 2 p.m.
Okay.
Yeah, Liz apologizes, but she's in a room by herself, no microphone connected, and she's been in here for the past 57 years, which is how long she's been alive. Mental state similar to a certain member of the Kennedy family who had a trepanation. But me, I'm an elf. What are we talking about?
What are you talking about?
It's gaslighting. Well, we have a really great interview.
You know what? Actually, this does line up because I'm going to say this. You know where what we could call gaslighting is a counterinsurgency tactic, which is exactly how it's being deployed against me.
Maybe you
right
shouldn't
now.
be such an insurgent on our group project that we're doing for school. Liz, it's middle school. Wake up. Liz, wake up. We are interviewing Orasami Burton, author of the upcoming book Tip of the Spear, on his work about counterinsurgency techniques.
Yes.
MK Ultra.
Yes.
The American prison system.
Yes.
Foreign prison systems.
Yes.
The Attica Revolt. George Jackson. And a whole bunch of other shit. Let's just, you know what? Why would you hear me say that? You just
I know.
listen, interview.
It's really great, unlike what you all just listened to.
Ladies and gentlemen, prisoners, prison guards, insurgents, and counterinsurgents alike, welcome to the main event. I don't know why I always call it the main event. I feel like that's like a holdover from my days in combat sports.
No, yeah, it is an MC for a boxing ring.
Exactly. But you know what? I've always said that there's only one thing you can compare podcasts to, and that is professional boxing. Welcome to the show. We have with us here today Orasami Burton, assistant professor at American University and author of the upcoming Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt, coming out in October, although I don't have a specific date, and I'm going to prod him for that, although that it does not appear to be on their fucking UED, University of California Press website. What day is it?
Halloween.
Is it really?
You're joking. It's coming out on the scariest day of the year.
That's it, October 31st.
That's nice.
But it is coming out then, and we are fucking stoked to have you. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We were just talking before we started recording about how we have done a lot of episodes in the past talking about policing technologies and situating the kind of emergence and development of policing technologies in a kind of history of counterinsurgency tactics, beginning in like the late 50s and 60s into the 70s. We've had episodes on COINTELPRO. We've done episodes on MK Ultra, but we've never really done an episode or talked to anyone specifically about the kind of technology of prisons and how the development of prisons are kind of situated within this history, and particularly in a history of counterinsurgency within the U.S. But that's pretty much what your work is about. So it's good to have you here. You call this the Carceral Warfare Project. Can you explain to our listeners exactly what you mean by that?
Sure. Many of your listeners may have seen some version of the graphs which show the exponential growth of the prison population in the U.S. beginning in the late 60s, but really taking off in 1973, after which there's consecutive growth each year up until 2014, leading to what many call mass incarceration. And there are various explanations for this, right? The conservative explanation is that it's a response to rising crime. That's not true. There are other kind of conservative explanations that sort of frame it as a natural response to demographic and population pressures. Then there are sort of left liberal explanations, the war on drugs, the war on crime, which are not wrong. There are explanations around the prison as a solution to the sort of endemic crises of capitalism, that prisons had to expand in order to absorb populations for whom there was less and less work for them to do in a neoliberal economy. And so my work doesn't attempt to sort of dispel these explanations, but it adds another layer that often gets left out, which is the extent to which prisons were a response to radical and revolutionary social movements in the United States, but that were inspired by and materially linked to global third world struggles. And so my work really focuses on uh, a constellation of organizations: the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, the Young Lords Party, the Weather Underground, and other lesser known sort of radical Marxist third world political formations. And if we think about the history of the mid to late 60s and early 70s, it was a time of intense instability. Rebellions, riots, insurrections that were becoming increasingly politicized and that were becoming increasingly organized. And so you see sort of state actors in the sort of power structure, the hierarchy, police agencies, government, start to narrate these movements using the language of insurgency. They start to look upon these movements as insurgencies. But not only that, the people who were engaged in these struggles were also thinking about them in that way, right? And so part of the solution to this problem of intensifying radicalism and rebellion was to incarcerate the movement, to incarcerate the struggle, to incorporate these people, to take them out of circulation and to confine them into prisons in order to preserve the stability of the sort of social order in a moment of intense political and economic transformation. So I'm still talking about the early 60s to the 1970s. And so you see the rise of political imprisonments. So you mentioned that you did a episode on COINTELPRO, and the focus of that was Chicago. So you had the big Chicago 7 trial, right? Happening at around the same time was the trial of the Panther 21, which was it was the sort of 21 members of the leadership, some of the key organizers and intellectuals of the New York chapter of the Black Panther Party, were taken out of circulation and held in jail for almost 2 years on trumped up charges. And it was really a political strategy orchestrated by the FBI and the Bureau of Special Services and Investigation, the NYPD's political Red Squad, to take these political leaders out of circulation in order to pacify the broader population. So this is the first step of what I'm calling the carceral warfare project: the use of prisons as a method of counterinsurgency, as a method of taking political radicals and revolutionaries and people who were potentially radical and revolutionary, right? So the lumpen proletariat, people who could be easily radicalized because of the conditions of their existence, because of their biographies of sort of being squeezed by capitalism and racism. And so therefore they would, be conducive to radicalization. That's the first step. But my book shows that this strategy essentially backfired. Because if we think about the prison as a solution to the urban rebellions of the 1960s, which in part that's how they were being deployed, what you see, especially starting in 1968, is an uptick in prison rebellions. And the prison rebellions become increasingly politicized and organized in very intense ways, very sophisticated ways. And so, the sort of national security apparatus thought that they could just incarcerate these populations and sort of hold them in prisons as reservoirs. But what they learned is that the technologies of incarceration were not up to the task of dealing with the level of organization that these people were beginning to develop. And so prisons themselves had to reform and evolve and incorporate new technologies of counterinsurgency, similar to what police had done in preceding decades. And so the broader argument of the book is prisons of today in the US and elsewhere are the way they are in part because they're institutionalized forms of counterinsurgency or counter-revolutionary warfare.
So something that comes to mind, when you talk about, especially the trial of the Panther 21, or really all. I mean, it's so apparent. Even a cursory knowledge of the history of the Black Panther Party, or really in broader, a lot of the history of sort of the radical insurgent left, I guess you could say, in the 1960s through 1970s. You see so many arrests over bogus charges of leaders, and they're sort of sequestered away for a while in the hopes that the movement will succumb to, whatever other COINTELPRO strategies are being devised. And you can see that this is so similar to another, I guess, instance of a state repressing a large amount of revolutionaries, which is Russia in the early 20th century, where they would have the system of internal exile, where they would send out people who were highly politicized into these kind of prison-like conditions, or sometimes what I guess you might call a precursor to a sort of strategic Hamlet system, but far away from everybody else, in the hopes that they would kind of just disappear. But what actually happened is that they'd have a lot of time to write and think, but they would have a lot of time to actually strengthen and broaden, I guess, their revolutionary desires, and then would return, or would be or escape, and be able to actually strengthen the relationship with the masses because of what they learned there. And so you see this in the 1960s and 70s, this incredibly targeted state repression of revolutionary leaders with the purposes of whatever, maybe imprisoning for life, maybe killing them, but just getting them out of the milieu that they were in, and then putting them somewhere where they, hopefully couldn't fuck with any. And a good place for that is usually, it's prison. You put my ass in prison, I guarantee, I'm sorry, you're never hearing from me again. I'm going to be in there.
Yeah, I'm going to file that one away.
I'm just probably going to work on myself and maybe get, go to they have a gym there. Maybe they let me use it. Probably not. But as you were saying, this backfires, and prisons become, much like the inner cities of Chicago or Oakland or New York, become a battleground for both the forces of government reaction, or reaction in the government, and for these sort of street level revolutionaries are transported from their previous environment of where they were from to these prisons. And as you said, it backfires pretty tremendously.
You used the phrase battleground, which I think is appropriate, especially given the overarching analytic of warfare that I'm employing, but also many of the sort of intellectuals of the movement, organic intellectuals of the movement, began to call prisons universities. Because these were, and you said sort of in jest that sort of like political prisoners in the Soviet Union did a lot of studying, but of course that's true. And it was also true in the United States. And so, yes, they started to call the prisons the universities of revolutionaries. And part of the theory was that prisons and prison existence is an intensification of the power relationships that exist in the outside world. And so it's a distillation of the various kinds of dominance and repression. And so pedagogically, these intellectuals actually found it easier to politicize and radicalize the sort of lumpen class in prison, because they were being squeezed by an unambiguously sort of carceral regime. And so, and because the resources and the educational resources were so limited, it was really up to them to develop their own political theories. They had sophisticated methods of smuggling material. They created their own newspapers, which they sort of rewrote by hand and distributed. They had secret codes for communicating. Some of them, learned African languages such as Swahili so that they could talk to each other without the guards knowing what they were saying. So a very kind of robust and sophisticated revolutionary culture developed within this context.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is that kind of understanding the prison as this kind of dynamic technology, as a, kind of like plastic or like pliable counterinsurgent strategy is supported not just by, the kind of lens that you're looking at this through this, but by how people within the state talked about the development of prisons itself. And that includes, members of Congress. That includes, I think, security state personnel, through the 60s and the 70s, the way in which kind of internally the state would talk about prisons also changed, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's one figure who I talk about in the book. His name is Robert R.J. Galati. I'm still trying to find more information about this guy, but he was in the NYPD for over 2 decades. He rose to a very high level and became sort of head of a political police squad that I actually hadn't heard of. I'm not sure if it's in Boss or if it's something else. But later he gets hired by the governor, Nelson Rockefeller, to establish a new agency in New York State called the New York State Identification and Intelligence System. The New York State Identification and Intelligence System, or NISIS, at the time was the largest social science database ever created on Earth. At least that's what, according to them. It was situated in a new department and basically had its purview was to oversee all of the sort of intelligence and statistical information having to do with prisons, having to do with parole, probation, courts. The whole sort of carceral system became computerized. And prior to that, it was all by paper files. So this was sort of and this is right at the same time when airlines are starting to use computers to automate the purchasing of tickets. And so the carceral system, especially in New York, was really at the cutting edge of the implementation of these different technologies. Now, that same technology, NISIS, had been used a few years earlier to help facilitate the application of counterinsurgency in Thailand. That was how they kept track of insurgents and kept track of sort of geographic coordinates. And it was sponsored by the Systems Development Corporation, which was a offshoot of the Rand Corporation, which used to be part of the federal government, but then broke out and became a separate think tank and is essentially one of the largest and most storied counterinsurgency think tanks in the world. And so, again, in very material ways, the prison, and I think it's important that we think about the prison broadly. When I say the prison, I'm not actually talking about just the brick and mortar buildings where people are disappeared. I'm talking about this broader structure of carceral domination where certain categories of people can be taken out of circulation and neutralized. People might know that term neutralization from the FBI. It's used in COINTELPRO documents, but it's a counterinsurgency term that means convert, capture, or kill. And so neutralize means all of those things. And so the prison is a technology of neutralization that, beginning in this moment, the pivot between the 60s and 70s increasingly incorporates various kinds of biomedical technology, computerized technology, sort of strategies and tactics of war. And exactly what you're saying is correct. The best way to think about it is as a dynamic strategy and technology that's constantly changing.
I mean, you mentioned right there, right, that some of these literal technologies were used in counterinsurgencies in South Asia. And, I think that's a kind of a good point to go off of there, is because I think the way that a lot of people on the left saw this, especially on the left that was like, towards like the Black Panther Party and these sort of like internal nations in the U.S., was that they were part of a global struggle of the third world against, Western or American capitalism. And I think, again, to kind of harken back to one of the earlier points we were making, is that it seems like both they believe this and the jailers believe this, right? And so it's like you have these two groups, like, who are actually the ones who are fighting this war, right? Like you have the people who are in charge of the prisons, in charge of the FBI, who are actually pulling the triggers on the government side, and then you have the people who are in prison, who are in the streets, who are underground, who are fighting against that, sort of fighting this hidden war that the public sees parts of, right? Like they'll see maybe a prison riot, or they'll see a shootout at a courthouse, or they'll see like sort of parts of it. But if you actually look at the history of it holistically, you see that this is one long continuous war, and the battlegrounds change a little bit, and certain forces win in one sector and then others in the other. But like they truly, both sides sort of were almost united in this kind of weird way of actually seeing how it was, which was another front in sort of this global civil war that was happening throughout the, well, I guess, mid-period of the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s as well. But I mean, that is something that's really fascinating to me, because so much of what happened in America during this time mirrors what was happening also in the Phoenix Project in Vietnam. Neutralization, like you're talking about. Kill, capture, convert, neutralize through any way, and that did happen. There were a lot of converts. There were a lot of people killed, and there were a lot of people captured. One thing that you talk about here is just the sort of intense amount of energy that the government was directing at. That they saw that this was a problem for them, and they were right to an extent. Like oftentimes the government sort of will maybe overreact on some things, and repress some things that maybe weren't actually happening. But in this case, there really was a big upswing of revolutionaries, taking hold of the prisons. And so, can you tell me some more about some of these other programs that they developed? I mean, PrisAct.
Yeah, for sure. Let me just say one thing. You made this really important point, which is like it wasn't just sort of Black and third world revolutionaries who understood themselves as an oppressed nation, right? So one of the shifts between the sort of Black Power movement and civil rights is an analytical shift, right? The demand around civil rights is complete, for Black people to have complete inclusion into the sort of American project, whereas Black Power employed a revolutionary nationalist analysis, in which they understood Black and other sort of minoritized populations as oppressed nations within the United States. And so the goal was not for inclusion into the United States, but was for some form of decolonization, right? And what you said is really important, that they weren't the only ones who were thinking about things in this way. And so one example of this is one of the Nixon recordings. Nixon famously recorded all of his meetings, right?
Never do that. If you're listening to this, never record, especially if you're just like drunk talking about Jewish people or whatever. Don't do that. It's going to get out there.
So Nixon was a key figure in the Attica prison rebellion of 1971, in which nearly 1,300 incarcerated, mostly Black, but also Latino and white prisoners seized Attica prison and engaged in what I would call revolutionary action for 4 days. And that rebellion was brutally crushed when Nelson Rockefeller called in the New York state troopers to commit a mass slaughter. And Nixon encouraged Rockefeller to do that. And so Nixon has this recording, which I think was recorded on the day of the massacre, September 13th, 1971. And I believe he was talking, I might be wrong, he does have several meetings, but I believe he was talking to Bob Dole, who at that point was the chairman of the Republican National Committee and a high-level advisor. And so in this conversation, Nixon's talking about, he's pressuring Dole to answer the question of, are there any true democracies in Africa? They're just having a conversation about any of the newly independent nations of Africa. Are any of them really democracies? And of course, the answer for them is no, because they're racist and Black people aren't capable of democracy. But they're having this conversation. And then he compares the lack of democracy in the decolonizing third world. And he says, just like what happened in that prison over there. And at that moment, the only thing he could be talking about is Attica. And see, part of what you need to understand is that during the 4 days where they seized the prison, they created a kind of their own form of government.
Yeah.
And the government was really concerned about this. They were interested in it and concerned about it. And so it's just fascinating that Nixon, the president of the United States, was also interested and concerned in the form of government that had been established in this prison rebellion and connected it to nations that were that had, fought and won their independence throughout the third world. So that's just a kind of an aside.
Just to pause real quick on Attica, I think Attica's very interesting for a lot of reasons, but also because of what comes after Attica, which is when the kind of dominant, I guess I would say, I don't know, like mainstream liberal narrative of like what's wrong with prisons kind of comes out of that, where they say, oh, it's just, kind of the like kettle boiling over sort of theory, like social theory. And a lot of the sort of more radical history that you're illuminating gets kind of obfuscated, right? And a lot of the stuff that especially the government is saying, Rockefeller, you could spend 2 hours talking about that crazy guy. And we should talk about him.
Freak.
A lot of his intentions and the sort of technologies that people were responding to or coordinating against or responding against, all of that sort of gets erased a little bit in favor of this sort of like, I don't know, like liberal social theory that, prison's just, it's just a hotbed, you get, the conditions are too bad, which of course they are, and people are just responding to and going a little crazy, and we need to kind of alleviate some of that pain, and we can just make them better, right? And that becomes really dominant. I mean, I know that the like Attica Commission report, I can't remember the name of it, but it was like a bestseller. It was very, very popular. Because at this time, all of those sort of, for some reason, all of these like government social reports became bestsellers for some reason.
Early 70s was big for that.
Absolutely, yep, the Kerner Commission. Yeah, so the Attica Commission report, produced by lawyers and law students at NYU, was sold as a mass market paperback to a broad audience. And they interviewed hundreds of people, and it really is the sort of dominant archival resource for Attica. Interestingly enough, after the rebellion, the people who were identified as the leaders of the rebellion and people who were identified as revolutionaries, everyone was tortured afterwards.
Yeah.
The people who weren't killed were tortured. Some people were tortured and killed. But the people who were identified as leaders and revolutionaries were marked with an X on their back, and they were isolated into Attica Solitary Confinement Unit, which is called HBZ. And the McKay Commission never interviewed those people. And so that's really significant because the people who would have been the sort of key organizers, the people who would have been most able to articulate the political dynamics of what was unfolding were excised from that narrative. And that, I think, was the beginning of this sort of liberalization of the Attica narrative, which has persisted for the past, for the subsequent, decades. And that's really the narrative that I'm attempting to destabilize and explode and demonstrate the extent to which there was an actual revolutionary war unfolding in and through prisons. And in fact, the liberal narrative that you're talking about is part of the strategy of counterinsurgency to sort of erase that history from our collective memory and to convince us that prison struggles were always only about, the need for more, for better food, for better clothing, for for improvements to conditions, which of course are very important. But that's not all that the people at the front of that movement wanted. They had revolutionary desires, aspirations, they had revolutionary theory, and they were engaged in communication with people who also were involved in revolutionary struggle, outside of the prison, outside of the state that they were in, and outside of the country.
Yeah, you mentioned that that the documents from Attica were being read by South Vietnamese prisoners or by Vietnamese prisoners in the South Vietnam government's prison, which I did not know. That's extraordinary.
Yeah, so there's this really interesting figure. You mentioned the Phoenix program. There's this really interesting figure named Donald Bordenkircher, who
Crazy name.
who came up in the ranks as a prison guard in San Quentin. San Quentin is where Eldridge Cleaver had been incarcerated and where George Jackson had been incarcerated. And George Jackson, for your listeners who might not know, is maybe the key theorist of the prison as Revolutionary War. He wrote 2 books. Soledad Brother and Blood in My Eye is really a very powerful work of revolutionary theory that folks should read if they're interested in it. Bordenkircher came up through California. He rose up in the ranks. And then in 1967, he was tapped by the Office of Public Safety, which was essentially a cover for the CIA to be a technical advisor for the directorate of the South Vietnamese prison system. And so from 1967 to 1971, he was in South Vietnam helping to reform and refurbish the prison system to more effectively work as an instrument for neutralizing the so-called Viet Cong and political prisoners and potential political prisoners. And in that context, he's talking explicitly not about sort of rehabilitation, which often is a kind of euphemism for other forms of psychological warfare. Mm-hmm. He talks very clearly about the need to engage in psyops. But the psyops that he engages in are, it's the same methods that he used in U.S. prisons, right? And this is the same person who was responsible for a scandal that broke, I think it was in 1970 or maybe 1971, the so-called Tiger Cages of Vietnam, where it was revealed that Vietnamese men, women, and children who were incarcerated in the prison system there were, being, tortured brutally, chained naked in underground pits and starved and just horrible. So this is Bordenkircher who did this. So he's in Vietnam. He goes from San Quentin to Vietnam. He leaves Vietnam in 1971. He comes back to Washington, D.C. And works for a federal agency there, and his role there is not entirely clear. I write in one of my articles about his relationship to Prizex, which I know you want to talk about, Brace. But after, so then he becomes a warden in West Virginia, known for his brutality and violence. He becomes a warden in Kentucky, known for his brutality and violence. Mm-hmm. But then much later, he goes overseas again, this time to Iraq, where he becomes placed in charge of Abu Ghraib after the sexual torture scandal breaks. He's the one who's brought in to sort of manage the fallout from that. So we see this, circulation of these sort of counterinsurgency actors across different sites of conflict and different eras of conflict even.
I mean, that's extraordinary because I don't think I've had a clear example on this show of this thing that we talk about where these sort of practices are refined on the frontiers, brought back home, and then it seems like exported once again to the frontiers to be used against people. I mean, that is
Right.
that guy. I mean, especially starting at San Quentin is
Yep.
fucking crazy because so much of the stuff we're talking about centers around San Quentin.
Yeah, for sure. I think, and I think that there's this misconception that the flow of counterinsurgency expertise. People often say, it's tested overseas and then it's brought home. I think it's unidirectional.
Yeah.
Unidirectional?
No.
Or it's
Bidirectional.
multidirectional.
Wait, let's say
Bidirectional.
this: it's
Yeah.
dialectical.
Oh, there you go.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Like, we got to talk about George Jackson for a second here too, because like Attica, I think he is sort of one of the main figures of this general thing that we're talking about. I mean, George Jackson, like you said, is a perfect example of the sort of politicized prisoner, of like the lumpen turned into like a revolutionary. Because as far as I know, I mean, he was arrested not for a political crime but for petty crime in the early 1960s and discovered politics while in prison, and through that became he wrote these two incredible books, but became really the main theorist of the political movement within the American prison system.
Yep. And he became politicized by reading about the Vietnam War. By reading about the Vietnam, the anti-colonial movement in Vietnam. And a famous quote that's often attributed to him is, when the prison gates fly open, the real dragons will fly out, right? Which is a sort of statement about the amount of political, radical, and revolutionary capacity that's incarcerated within these prisons, right? And George Jackson did say that, but in fact, he appropriated that from Ho Chi Minh, who had said that years earlier about, during his political imprisonment in Kong Song Island, the prison in Vietnam in Kong Song Island, which is where Bordenkercher later is deployed. So, I think in a lot of ways, George Jackson represents the precise figure that this new carceral counterinsurgency technology is designed to forestall, to prevent. The prisons had to transform in order to prevent new George Jacksons from being formed, because he wasn't political when he went in, but he was intensely political at the time that he was assassinated in prison in 1971, August 21st, 1971. And so his brief life of incarceration represents precisely what I mean when I say that the prison sort of backfired as a strategy of counterinsurgency, because rather than countering insurgency, it was actually producing insurgency. And that insurgency was then seeping out of the walls. It wasn't just staying within the walls. People were getting out and were developing new political formations. And so this is exactly what prisons, had to evolve in order to control. And one of the ways that they did that was through a little known program called the Prizax program. That's a FBI portmanteau for Prison Activist Surveillance Program. And essentially it's the counterintelligence program, but inside the prison. So that's the best way that I can say it. There's far fewer documents about the Prizax program than there are for COINTELPRO, primarily because, Prizax emerged at a time when there was intense public scrutiny on the FBI and other intelligence agencies.
Right.
So COINTELPRO had already been exposed. And so I think they changed their documentation strategy, right? Because, COINTELPRO is formally terminated in 1971, but there's an exception clause. It says, no more. This is obviously a paraphrase. The document says, no more COINTELPRO operations will be authorized except in extreme circumstances when such activities are warranted.
And it's always
So
extreme circumstances when
Right.
activities
So
are
Exactly.
we can't do it unless it's exceptional circumstances,
Right.
which of course it always
Yeah.
is when we need it to be.
Right. And they called the people that they were targeting extremists. So they were definitionally extreme. So their very existence was an extreme circumstance that warranted these kinds of measures. And so, it becomes a challenge to sort of track and narrate these, historically narrate this stuff, because the archival record is very thin by design. And so, I do a lot of oral history and talking to other people about their experiences, because the documents themselves tell us very little about how the program functioned on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to the term neutralize, right? You're talking about kill, incarcerate, or convert. And, looking back at the history throughout the 1960s, 1970s, to when things were, I guess you could say, hot on the streets here in America, the government was, I think, you kind of got to be forced to admit, fucking pretty good at it, right? I mean, they killed most people, or they didn't kill most people, but they killed a lot of the leaders of whatever revolutionary movement. They flooded communities with drugs. And they fucking arrested a shit ton of people, and they neutralized the ones that they couldn't. And so, in terms of how this technology was deployed throughout, like the you're talking about, kind of coming out here in 1974, ongoing. I mean, it seems like the government really took this stuff seriously and did whatever they could. So, like, what are some examples of what they were doing inside of prisons, or like what they were doing to people to prevent, I guess, what the government would call to prevent radicalization, right, or to neutralize any sort of political instincts of incarcerated people?
Yeah. So first, I mean, I think you're right. I think I in terms of the government being good at it, I also think we have a tendency to overestimate their intelligence and competence. I think, there's like tons of fuck ups and like weird
Yes,
shit
yeah.
that they did and stuff that didn't work. I mean, the thing that they have in their favor is like they're very rarely held accountable. So they can make mistakes and then just keep trying and trying. Like they don't end up usually in prison, or dead
Yeah.
for making a stupid
Yeah, exactly.
mistake.
Unless someone breaks into your fucking office, no one's gonna find out what you're doing anyways.
Yeah. I mean, until you outlive your usefulness and they just cut the ties. So in terms of what they were doing, there's different. So part of what counterinsurgency is it's population warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's different strategies that are targeted for different kinds of populations. And so, the first thing that they did was to enhance their intelligence gathering capacity, because that's what you need in order to carry out an effective counterinsurgency. You need to know who the real revolutionaries are, and who the true believers are, and who the sort of fellow travelers are, and who are the people that you can easily cleave from the movement and sway to your side. And the techniques that are deployed against these different populations are specifically tailored for the characteristics of that population. And so Prizax and, MK Ultra, which also shows up in my research, those are targeted towards people who can't be bargained with, people who are understood to be and who understand themselves to be actual revolutionaries. But that's a minority of the population. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of the population are understood to be people who can be sort of bribed or bought off or reasoned with. And the methods that were used to neutralize them were actually seemingly benign and seemingly humanitarian. So something like, prison education programs, right? The insinuation of universities into prisons in order to help give formal education to incarcerated people. This actually came into being in the counterinsurgency context. Because, like I said earlier, revolutionaries were calling prisons the universities of revolution. And so part of how they tried to destabilize that and to sort of stem the proliferation of revolutionary ideology was by allowing formally trained university educators to come in and to bring in more standard curriculum that was oriented towards encouraging incarcerated people to aspire to sort of buy into the American system and the American dream and that kind of thing. So that's one example of maybe a counterintuitive method, a method that is less sort of spectacular and sensational, but one that was extremely effective because it could be effectively cloaked and narrated as a kind of liberal humanitarian reform. And this again plays into what we were discussing earlier in terms of the sort of liberal narrative of Attica, right? Because the story of what happens after Attica is this story of reform and how the prisons got better after Attica. But if you place those reforms within the context of counterinsurgency, they take on an entirely different meaning and character.
You mentioned MK Ultra, and we gotta pause there because that's another program that obviously looms large alongside COINTELPRO, the Phoenix program, other ones in the history of kind of counterinsurgency tactics and the development of different strategies in the U.S. And I mean, from my understanding is that you didn't mean to kind of become a kind of MK Ultra guy. Not that you are an MK Ultra guy, if that is a guy.
That is definitely a guy.
But your
I think
research,
I might be that guy.
Yeah, I think we all are in our own way. Because the problem is that you start looking into any of this kind of stuff, and you inevitably end up there, right? Because as much as people have tried to tamp down its significance, MK Ultra does loom large here, and it was a major program that had long-lasting effects in terms of the development of different counterinsurgency tactics that we still see utilized today. So what is the kind of, where do we encounter MK Ultra within the development of prison technologies in the U.S.?
You know, the thing that's hard about MK Ultra, at least for me, is again, as you said, I didn't start out wanting to talk about MK Ultra. So it was a slow, gradual process of me sort of eventually just resigning myself to say, okay, like I actually, this is what I'm talking about, to like commit to this, right? Because, you know, I've been working on this book, doing research on the book for about 9 years. It was a 9-year process. And I would just get these little hints or these little things that were just weird. And at first I would ignore them. So one example is the fact that in 1966, Nelson Rockefeller established a contract for psychologists and psychiatrists from the Allen Memorial Institute in Canada to come to New York to start to do psychiatric programs in New York. So like that's just a thing that happened. Okay. So anyone who knows anything about MK Ultra knows that the Allen Memorial Institute is home to MK Ultra Subproject 68, in which, the CIA, in collaboration with the Canadian government and the Rockefeller Foundation, which actually helped establish the Allen Memorial Institute, hired a Scottish psychiatrist who was then based in New York. His name was Ewan Cameron, to carry out a wide array of mind manipulation experiments. Essentially, he wanted to figure out if he could do what he called de-pattern people's minds, to basically erase their minds. Was that possible, to erase the human mind? And was it also possible to introduce new thoughts and ideas and impulses into human consciousness that were not originally there, or that were maybe contrary to the will of the person who's being victimized by these experiments. So Ewan Cameron is not the one who came to New York, but doctors from that institute came to New York. So like that was one big thing where I was like, that's weird. But it's like for me, because my work, I try to be very historically rigorous because I'm making such bold claims, and because I'm contradicting already established narratives, that I try to have a very high sort of evidentiary apparatus. And so that I had to reach a really high threshold of data and material in order to finally say, okay, MK Ultra was happening in New York. And it just sort of happened as a gradual accumulation of information until finally I couldn't ignore it. So that's sort of how I got into it. And then you asked, the role of MK Ultra in prison and these counterinsurgency technologies. Well, it's interesting. A lot of this stuff is public knowledge, but people have just chosen to forget it or haven't.
No, that's so true.
So it's like, if you put in the right search terms, a lot of the stuff will come up in the Washington Post or the New York Times or the LA Times, right? So the sort of key MK Ultra site for prisons that we know about is Vacaville Medical Institution in California. Eldridge Cleaver spent time there. Huey Newton spent time there. If you Google Vacaville, the list of people who spent time there is pretty impressive, actually. But the CIA admitted that it was an MK Ultra site in 1978. Once they were forced to, once the information came out, and so basically they were just trying to figure out how to fuck with people, how to manipulate people. Were there certain kinds of people who were more conducive to control? Were there certain kinds of people who were more resistant to control? And then sometimes it was just like, oh, we need to test this drug. Let's just give it to these prisoners to see what will happen. And then maybe the experiment is successful in air quotes, maybe it fails in air quotes, but either way, that's more information, because the drugs can then be used for a wide variety of reasons. So there was a whole host of different experiments, and people were passing through these prisons that were engaged in MK Ultra research elsewhere. So not just in prisons, in mental institutions, in sort of like residential schools for children. The CIA agents were experimenting on each other. And the full scope will never be known, because Richard Helms, the director of the CIA in 1973, destroyed as many of the MK Ultra files as he could. And so the only reason we know what we know is because there was a misfiled box that someone found in 1977, I think.
Yeah. One of the things we've talked about on this show too, in I think it was in the game series, we talked about Lexington, which was the big sort of both hospital and drug prison, I guess you could call it, but kind of a combination of the two. And there were experiments that were ongoing there for years, in which mostly black residents / inmates, because they were both there, were given, were made to stay up for, several days on LSD, or were given, cocaine. It was actually kind of insane, because they just tested all kinds of drugs on people in ways that you were like, we don't really need to know the effects of what it's like to stay up for 5 days on cocaine. First of all, I could tell you that, but second of all, it's I don't know how much what medical research that's really giving. But another way to look at it is instead, literally testing drugs upon inmates who can't do anything about it. And in the case of Lexington, ironically, mostly who were in there either to get off of drugs or they were sent there because they were arrested for doing drugs, which will follow them around for the rest of their life.
Yep. And a lot of these were drug treatment programs.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned with the with a lot of the McGill doctors coming into New York, that was part of a therapeutic community that they were fostering in upstate New York. And that, throughout the 1960s and 1970s, you start to see the emergence of a lot of those. We also talked about this in the game series, about TrueAnon being contracted by, I think it was the Nevada state government, I think in Arizona at one point or somewhere else in the Southwest, to create these TCs within, therapeutic communities within the prison system. And you also, of course, have the case of the Black Cultural Association, which kind of what gave rise to Donald DeFreeze and the SLA. And you see these, and if I may digress for a little bit, which was also, by the way, the guy who was in charge of that worked for the U.S. government in Vietnam. Colston Westbrook, a real fucking creature. But you can see all of these as not even necessarily being part of MK Ultra, although obviously some were, but the MK Ultra parts, all the other parts that are sort of just like adjacent to it, being part of this general machinery of counterinsurgency, right? Because something you mentioned earlier was the universities kind of being brought into prisons to replace what were thought of as revolutionary universities. I think the BCA, the Black Cultural Association, which Colston Westbrook was in charge of, is a great example of that, because that was really brought in by the prison officials, and sort of all of these kind of black, and Latino and white radicals sort of joining it and volunteering at it, and then this the SLA coming out of that, and that being a group which I think a lot of people at this point have realized that there was probably some connections to the government with that group. And there's a great, I can't remember what newspaper it is. I think it's a Michigan newspaper that has a really great contemporaneous sort of expose. And I know Mae Brussel did a lot of stuff on that as well. Yep. But you can see all of this and the MK Ultra stuff, as part and parcel of just the government just throwing all of these different tactics and techniques at imprisoned people to prevent any sort of radicalization, to prevent another Attica or to prevent another George Jackson.
So there's the political aspect, there's the counterinsurgency aspect, but I don't think counterinsurgency can explain all of the fuckery that happens in these places. So I think some of what's going on is just torture for its own sake.
Yeah, I was
experimentation for its own sake.
Sadism.
Cruelty, right? Because it's like, what are they still trying to figure out in 1973? I mean, they had been doing it since the 50s. It's like, what is it every new, like, are they just trying every single dose of a specific drug? You know what I mean? It's like, it kind of blows my mind, because MK Ultra is formally terminated in 1963 or 64. I'm sorry. So I use the term MK Ultra broadly, just like you were saying, Brace. But yeah, I think, because they were doing sexual experiments on people too, trying to figure out how to manipulate people's sexuality, all kinds of stuff. And so I think so counterinsurgency is part of it, but also I think the CIA just recruits these really sort of grotesque, ghoulish figures and then sets them loose. And they're empowered to just do whatever they want. And so I think sometimes they're just doing it because they can. And that part of it is even more terrifying to me than the counterinsurgency aspect of it.
Fuck. I mean,
I think we should kind of wrap up here, just because that's so brutal.
One thing I often say to kind of mitigate the overwhelming sort of brutality of it all is, in my view, I know I just said it wasn't all about counterinsurgency, but much of it is. And one of the things that kept me going while doing this research is the sense that, the extent that the state was willing to go to develop these technologies is in some ways an index of the strength of the movements that they were arrayed against.
Sure. Yeah.
And that was one way for me to sort of maintain a sense of, optimism of the will as Gramsci would say. And one thing that helped me to not sink into despair, it's like, wow, these movements were this dynamic and complex and strong, that this constellation of state agencies had to do all of this to try to get it under control. And so there's a way in which you can look at that as kind of in a twisted way, inspirational in terms of the capacity for movements to develop.
Well, I think that's a perfect place. Before I can ask you any other questions that will just immediately make everyone depressed, I think that's kind of a perfect place to end it. I just want to thank you again for joining us. That fantastic. I'm going to let you sell the book to the people right now. You tell them what it is, where to get it, what it's about.
Well, I mean, if you want to get a hidden history of the revolutionary movements and insurgent movements of the 1970s, and a hidden history of counterinsurgency, domestic warfare, MK Ultra, COINTELPRO 2.0, the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, and thinking about what happens when these two social forces collide, then you should pre-order Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt, which comes out on UC Press, the University of California Press, on October 31st, 2023.
And we'll have a link to it in the show notes so everyone can pre-order it.
Thank you again so much for joining us. It was a fantastic interview, and we'll see you next time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
So the leprechaun.
Well, fuck, dude.
Is the leprechaun a hallucination? Like a meth hallucination?
Well, that's kind of what you don't know. Like, he's less ambiguous. He's kind of like the positive thing out there. He's kind of like an angel.
Yeah. Of death.
No,
of meth.
no, angel of meth. No, he's a real angel. He's kind of like, what's that movie? Is it Angels in the Outfield? What's where that dude where fucking, it's like the mad scientist from Back to the Future plays an angel?
Angels in the Outfield. Great movie.
He's kind of like an Angels in the Outfield, but for the tweaker that the movie's about.
I like that.
Bryce.
A little Tinkerbell.
It's about Bryce as the main character's name.
Okay, well,
but
we gotta
there's
change that
also
one.
kind of evil. The shadow people are kind of the enemies in it, but also a couple of 1970s Los Angeles beat cops, which you might be saying, oh, interesting, 1970s. I thought this took place in the future. Well, where do you see how that happens?
Little Looper.
But unfortunately, literally, it would take too long to explain
Yeah.
right now. We're going to have to save this for Friday's episode.
Here's a thought. If you can't make meth comedy work because, again, too much of an uphill battle, has anyone attempted a ketamine one?
Sorry, that was a joke in ketamine. It wasn't funny. How could you?
I don't know. I'm just trying to think of like if you could take the stoner comedy as a like little model.
Could you?
And use it in other drug
Is that
cases.
what Party Monster's about?
Because like alcoholic one, I guess that's a classic.
Yeah, Leaving
Sure.
Las Vegas.
Or
Fucking.
I was thinking of all the like
Gutbuster.
80s, like, you know.
Yeah, I'm a drunk frat boy
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah. Cocaine also. There's some kind of like cocaine comedy.
American Psycho.
American Psycho. Yeah, that sort of like genre of stuff. Heroin comedy. I feel like honestly, it plays.
Heroin's really more of a literary form.
It's exactly, yeah. Because it's like, is Kubla Khan really that funny, or is it
Right.
serious? Exactly. Is being happy funny? I don't know. All right, let's wrap this up.
I'm Liz. What?
Nothing. I said my name. I'm Brace. I'll say it again, I guess. And we're joined by producer Young Chomsky, who's his first episode today, replacing our last producer that we had. You remember his name, right? And
Yeah,
the
it was-
podcast is called, of course, Chapo Trap House. I'm Will Miniker. I'm joined by my co-host, Felix Biederman, and of course, our producer, Amber Frost. And thank you.
We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
That's what you want. Jeffrey Epstein. Please go show. Jeffrey Epstein. Please go show. Jeffrey Epstein. Please go show. Jeffrey Epstein. Come here.